Hey guys, what is up and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Yuzu Emulator once again, where in a Patreon preview build of 1 or 2 days, we have been shown some improvements coming to the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and many other games on this Nintendo Switch emulator. While this is, yes, a Patreon release version of Yuzu Emulator, it is, as I said, only going to be there for 1 or 2 days while they PR and get all of the updates you're going to be seeing in this video ready for full release into Yuzu's Canary version. On top of this, they have also semi-allowed the sharing of these builds. For example, if you join either my Discord or the official Yuzu Discord and just ask one of the Patron supporters for access to their build, they will gladly share it and be allowed to do so. Now, it might not sound like logical sense, the fact that I'll share it with you on my Discord, but not in this video, but if you think about it, it actually makes quite a bit of sense. For example, if in, say, 6 or 7 months time when someone finds this video and says, oh look, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is performing much better, and it's rendering really well as you're about to see, they would probably just download this build and potentially submit some kind of compatibility report, or maybe even some kind of bug reports on a version of the emulator that is very old, but in itself is an official release. This is exactly the reason why they don't really want this build shared en masse. They don't want people in future submitting compatibility reports for bugs that have been long fixed. This build itself is meant to be exactly what it is, a 1 or 2 day preview and a nice little sneak peek for all of the Patreon supporters of Yuzu Emulator. These guys are definitely deserving of any and all of our support, especially so with not only the changes we're about to see in this video, but all of the changes we've seen over the last year or so. When you take a look at these changes and consider the fact that Yuzu's Patreon for the amount of hard work they've put in is still well under $1,000 a month, it is truly criminal the amount of support that these guys aren't currently getting. With that said, if you want to head over and support them on their Patreon, you'll find a link for that down in the description. Now that we have been given access to these preview builds that we're going to be seeing, I guess, 1 or 2 day early access to some of these preview features, especially so since we're allowed to share these builds around with our friends in the emulation community, it's definitely a very nice incentive to support these guys. Moving on, let's take a look at some graphical fixes where you've already seen in the gameplay so far, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild has had almost all of its graphical issues that we previously saw on the last few builds fixed. Many of the issues and graphical fixes you're going to be seeing in this video have come thanks to developer Blinkhawk, so much thanks must be given to him for all of his tireless work over the last few weeks, especially so in relation to getting Breath of the Wild in a very good condition. While the game has been graphically enhanced, probably you would have to say in a dramatic fashion, there still are going to be graphical bugs, and in relation to why I don't have any audio playback in this video, I have basically had to remove it because Yuzu Emulator still thinks that most games are 60 frames per second, so if you're not getting 60 frames per second, the audio is going to be completely broken and garbled. But just look at that. Pretty much all of the major graphical issues we were seeing in the last few versions of Yuzu Emulator have now been completely fixed. Obviously, as I said, there are still going to be graphical issues, and in relation to performance, you can see that it's not exactly ideal running at anywhere between around a minimum of 10 to 12 frames per second, and the maximum I've seen in a shrine is about 48 to 50. Regardless of any of that, obviously this is completely unoptimized at this point in time, and hopefully by the time this arrives in Canary in the next day or so, it will be running even better than you're already seeing it running right now, which to be honest isn't the worst performance I've ever seen in this area. I do remember when Semi-Playable Emulator first released and was in this early stage, it was running much worse than this. So in respect to what has been fixed, if you haven't seen my last few videos, they completely fixed all of the terrain and water rendering. They have fixed any and all physics interaction issues, so this means that Link no longer sinks into the ground, and it also means that he is going to be able to correctly and fully use all of the runes in the game, for example Magnesis, Cryonis, or any of the other runes that require physical interaction. In respect to other games, as you can see here in Super Mario Odyssey, not only have they added the working bloom and area fog, they have also improved it since I last covered it in my video only a few days ago. You can see this correctly applied bloom emanating off of the Odyssey's balloon, and you'll also most likely notice it coming as light reflection from any of the desert sand. Now, in respect to performance in Super Mario Odyssey, both in this preview build and in any of the latest Canary versions, it's still very good. And since I've seen in several Reddit posts in the last few days that I'm only showing performance in not very demanding areas, I decided to show off what Super Mario Odyssey was performing like in this pretty much worst case scenario in Sand Kingdom in the ruins area, where you can see I'm pretty much at 58-60 frames per second, and once we get past the SVC load, which is pretty much unavoidable at this point in time, you can also see that generally my frame rate minimum is around 45 to 48 frames per second. Now we do drop, you will see, down to the 40s at times, but as I said, this is due to SVC or kernel load issues and is completely unavoidable, at least at this point in time in a Yuzu emulator. This is just one of those things that they're eventually going to have to fix, and as I've already said, with our continued support, I have absolutely no doubt that they will fix any and all of these issues. Again, in this short little gameplay snippet, you can see exactly what I was talking about with the bloom coming from the Odyssey's balloon and off the desert itself. Having all of these graphical effects now fixed is another step closer to this game being perfectly and accurately emulated. Yet another title that has seen improvements not only in this Patreon preview version, but also in the last few Canary versions is Splatoon 2. Graphically and performance-wise, this game has improved, although it still does have its large share of issues. For example, you can see just there, I was not able to successfully swim in the ink or paint or whatever you want to call it, and when I ink this wall here, you can see that inking it does work, but inking this wall doesn't. You can see by the way the ink is forming on the top of this wall, which I wasn't able to ink on. It seems as if Splatoon 2 is having some issues in respect to what levels or layers the ink is getting formatted onto. This is probably the reason that when you try to swim in it, you are able to gather paint, but you're not actually able to go under the surface of it. My guess would be that it's not being rendered on the correct level. Regardless of this though, it's still pretty cool to see performance and graphical optimizations, and again, hopefully we'll see even more improvements to this game in the coming weeks. Moving back across to Breath of the Wild, I just wanted to show you guys exactly what you can expect from a worst case and best case scenario for performance. Worst case scenario first, you can see I'm here in the Hyrule Castle area. In this very demanding area, you can see performance is around 12 to 15 frames per second, and when we jump across to the Gerudo Desert, this area being one of the lighter areas, at least in Breath of the Wild's overworld, you can see I'm running at around 25 to 27 frames per second, depending on what area or what camera angle I'm using. In respect to the fact that this game only just got graphically fixed in this build, this is definitely admirable and respectable performance. In relation to how the game runs in shrines, you can see that even though it is showing we are at 36 frames per second, the gameplay seems to be sped up quite a lot more than it should be at this frame rate. Hopefully this bodes well for us, the users of this emulator, and hopefully it also means that even though the frame counter is showing one frame rate, it might actually be running at another due to some kind of timing issue in this emulator. For example, in this short snippet of gameplay, even though the frame rate indicator shows I'm only running at around 14 frames per second, the game speed itself does seem to be a lot closer to around 20 or 21 frames per second and doesn't seem to be exhibiting as much slowdown as you would expect at a frame rate of around 14. This similar behavior can be seen in this area where instead of running at 17 frames per second, the game is seemingly running much closer to full speed. To be honest, this is more than likely going to benefit us, the user, as when they fix any and all of these timing issues, the game should be running at a much better performance. Or I guess you could also say instead of running at much better performance levels, it will be accurately displaying what its performance levels are. Now, in relation to bugs, the most prevalent one I would say that hinders gameplay is a very similar one to one we've seen on Semi-Playable, but is a little bit different. As you can see in the gameplay, when I position these bokoblins in the center of my screen, they aren't animated, but when you have them positioned on the outskirts of your screen, it's pretty clear to see that their animations and everything is running exactly as it should. In fact, several games on this Switch emulator exhibit very similar behavior. For example, in Super Mario Odyssey, you can see that there is culling in this situation at the very center of the screen, whereas the objects themselves are being correctly rendered on the outskirts in almost an identical situation and area of the screen to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. This bug can also be seen in relation to screen coordinate rendering in shadow resolution in many areas of the game. One such instance of this can be seen occurring right here in the Oasis area of Sand Kingdom, where you can see when we position these shadows on the outskirts of our screens, they are rendered at the correct resolution, while when moved to the center, they are culled down to a much lower res. Bugs aside, it's still absolutely mind-blowing to see the week in, week out progress that this Switch emulator has been making for the last year, and it definitely bodes very well for the future of this emulator, seeing constant updates and progress just like this one. As I said at the start of this video, guys, if you want to help to support this emulator's development, you can find their Patreon linked down in the description of this video. So please head on over there and pledge your support to these absolutely awesome developers. As always, guys, the best place to stay up to date on Yuzu Emulator is right here at BSoD Gaming. So once again, cheers for checking out this video. Remember to like it if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't, and as always, subscribe to the channel if you want to see all future videos from me.